Hi, Misha here, and recently I've done a couple of deep dive videos into fleets of various Star Trek alien races, beginning with the Romulans and doing the Cardassian and then Dominion ones. And now it's time to tackle the big one, the Klingon. They have among the most ships for an alien race, but more importantly, they're important as an alien species. Even though the Romulans were technically featured first in the original series, the Klingons have just grown to be the Star Trek alien race with the most in-depth lore and all that good stuff. So now we're going to look at their fleet from before Enterprise through the TOS era, and of course into TNG, DS9, and even into the STO era, Star Trek Online. Because I know there are a number of online fans, and even though I was a little slow to get into those ships, I admit they're pretty cool. So, as I've been doing, first we're going to do an in-universe dive looking at the ships, and then a real-world perspective with me just kind of talking about my personal opinions. And this will be a long video, so don't blame me at all if you need to watch it over several days. If you could, please do like, share, subscribe, and do feel free to comment so we can discuss. With that, let's dive in. Kapla! So, a little bit of Klingon Imperial history. Kahless, the Unforgettable, would defeat the tyrant Molor in the 9th century according to the Earth-Human calendar, and he would unify Kronos in the first true world empire. Of course there would be rebellions and whatnot, but interestingly the Klingons had a unified government quite early on. Keep in mind though, their home world was craggy, rocky, and settlements might have been few and far between. And there would be various wars and conflicts throughout, but around the 14th century, the Herc would raid, invade, sack the homeworld. And this would last for at least 1 century. And when they would leave, being pushed out or otherwise by the Klingons, much is lost to time, the Klingons would attain some of their technology. It's unclear if they had sub-light, non-FTL spaceflight before the Herc. Probably not. But they would acquire spaceflight from the Herc, as would other alien races like the Permelians, around the same time actually. And so therefore Herc designs would become prevalent, and you will see Klingons either repurposing left behind Herc ships or reverse engineering them. And we do see this type used by the Klingons for centuries, even retrograde versions made into the 23rd and 24th centuries. Presumably the original ones would use the same Lang cycle fusion engines as the Herc. These were large ships because they were slow, so traveling years, decades, maybe even a century through space, there needed to be room, although they were quite flat, without a huge number of decks. Regardless, they were roughly 600 meters long, ginormous for that time. And they had very separate command structures and engine structures for safety purposes. They did not have energy weapons, as best we can tell. They relied on ordnance, torpedoes of different type launchers, something that would have a great impact on later Klingon development. It's unclear if they had shielding. They probably just mostly relied on armor plating, maybe polarizing, or area type shielding, reactive type shielding. It's unknown. Certainly not modern style shielding. These were primitive spacecraft, but then again, as Jean-Luc Picard said, they were flown at a time when humans on Earth were still perfecting the mechanical clock. And they would be among the first Klingon spacecraft, giving a somewhat iconic design that would carry on forever, with the superstructure in the back and engines in the back, and a flared out body, and then a head module in the front. The fusion reactors and the equivalent warp nacelles would be these semicircular things on their wings. And these would prove to be very durable craft. Even some Permilian examples would survive in space for centuries. So it's little wonder that the Klingons would, at least some of the great houses, replicate these as personal transports, much as humans use sail ships even into the 20th and 21st century. And this would be among the first Klingon warships, but they would not be used for long-distance travel. In fact, after the Herc and their technology, the Klingon Empire, pushing them out, would begin to fracture again and go through a bit of a dark age following the 16th or 17th century. In fact, much to many in the Empire's later embarrassment, especially historians, they would even flirt with republic and democratic rule. This would not last long, though. By the end of the late 19th century, Earth calendar, or beginning of 20th, the Empire would reestablish itself. The royal family, which had continued on in one way or another since Kahless, had been murdered during the Republican era. But they would pick back up with the Imperial House, even granting themselves the former names and titles to make it look like an unbroken line of progression, succession. And they would rediscover space flight. Part of the reasons for the fighting on the planet were resources running out and the population growing. The Klingons were relatively long-lived, and while their rather violent nature would act as a natural form of population control, in the end, they decided, much as they had destroyed their own gods millennia before, instead of fighting each other, let's go into space. So they would revisit space travel, trying out their own designs. And here we have the Daspu class, which still uses some Herc technology, including the embedded nacelle systems, but is a necessarily more primitive shape, possibly for even easy assembly in orbit using modules from the planet, having an ordnance launcher, possibly an early energy cannon as well in the front, and then a major sublight thrust in the back. Presumably this would be the first Klingon vessel to use a version of impulse. Interestingly, for most races, impulse came after warp drive. How fast is this? We don't know, but probably not much more than warp 3, maybe 2.5. Like the previous class, whose name is kind of lost to time, it was quite large. Because at lower warp speeds, you need to carry many warriors long distances and carry all their supplies. And it was just a hull, a durable hull that would last for centuries in service and being used by several houses. I should point out that while the Emperor ruled the planet, he was advised by the High Council, led by the Chancellor. Power would sway back and forth over time, with the Emperor going from absolute ruler at some points to just a figurehead at others. And therefore the Chancellor's power would shift back and forth. Sometimes he would have much, sometimes little, sometimes the heads of the houses would have much, sometimes little, there would be unification. This was one of the more unified designs used by many houses, going out into space and raiding, conquering nearby races. Yes, it was quite large, probably 350, 400 meters. Keep in mind, though, it has a lot of internal volume. It's even possible it generated artificial gravity by spinning rather than having grab plating. We don't know. Lost to time. What's interesting, the name D7 became, at least retroactively speaking, the D2 cruiser. D could be said to be inspired by the name D7, which is boot spike, as, for example, boot on someone's neck. But officially later, D would stand for Devastator. That would mean retroactively the ship we just looked at is the D1. Again, historically speaking, just to give it a chronology. But yes, these would begin flying in the 20th century, possibly early 21st, and some houses would retrofit these and fly them into the 23rd, but at that point it was definitely considered an escort vessel, a supply vessel. It was not a frontline combat vessel. Also unknown if it used shielding, or if so, which type. Most likely, because of its bulky design, it just relied on armor. After all, even if the outer skin were burned or punched away, you have plenty of inner hull to keep on fighting with. And the embedded nacelles, which there are 2 of them, are well protected, but they are slow. You don't get a lot of warp field generation with this system, even if it does give armor and protection. But this is them shifting away from the Lang cycle system, possibly using early matter-antimatter reaction chambering. But we do know the next vessel, the D3, did use matter-antimatter reaction, including dilithium. Unknown if dilithium was native on Kronos or something they encountered when going out into the galaxy and raiding. Most likely that. But regardless, we move into perhaps the first somewhat recognizable Klingon battlecruiser. Launched in the mid-21st century Earth calendar, this is a return to a very large vessel, 6, perhaps 700 meters. However, a good chunk of that would be the new engine nacelles. Taking rough inspiration from the old Herc designs of circular and semicircular, they're now thrust out from the main hull and made much more powerful, although more exposed. On the other hand, this would be the first to definitely feature shielding, primitive as it might be, with the central body for the crew and warriors, and then a head for commanding. This would also have directed energy weapons, early versions of disruptor cannon, and it would continue the Klingon use of ordnance launchers. Early on, spatial torpedoes, but later would be refitted with photonic torpedoes. A large and powerful ship, it was capable of very high warp for its day. This would have been quite possibly the Empire's first Warp 5 vessel, something of a threshold to overcome for species, and really considered the minimum speed needed to really go out and establish long-distance travel and back and forth. The price it paid for the high speed were giant engines, and these were extremely resource-intensive and time-consuming to produce, so they would only build a few, possibly only 6 or 7, being designated as the Devastator 3 D3 type. And when these would go out with their intention of conquering and also bringing warriors home, dead or alive. They would be considered part of the Black Fleet. They became iconic, even religious examples, but then again, the Klingons always mixed religion and warfare. It's part of their nature. This design, the technology involved in it, was quite advanced, including the command systems. They used a type of virtual reality interface. And they had more advanced impulse systems. True matter, antimatter reaction with dilithium as the catalyst and control. For a time, this was about as advanced as the Empire would be. As I said, they were introduced around the mid-21st century, but then the Empire would go through a bit of a shake-up, as is wont to happen. And for a couple of decades, some of this technology would be lost or just simply too expensive to produce. So these would really become sought-after examples, as they weren't able, or practically speaking, willing to make more of them. So they would re-emerge throughout time. But early on, they were large because of their engines and because of the necessary room needed inside for hundreds of warriors on long-range conquest. Think of them as a Viking longboat of the space, going out, not to return for years. But the 22nd century, while we still see fracturing, does start to see unification again. And really, the Klingons getting out of the shadow of Herc technology or technology acquired from conquered alien races and developing their own. Even for a time, things like law, art, even science would show themselves. But by the mid-22nd century, the military would again gain prevalence, even though the High Council was split into two major factions. This schism would come to an end in 2151, and expansion was threatening to kick off again. After the political turmoil of the late 21st century, as the Empire moved into the 22nd century and expanded, and as the Warp 5 engine was miniaturized with newer technology, finally really jettisoning old technology from the Herc and others, the need was felt not to produce ships in the single digits or dozens, but in the hundreds, possibly even greater, and to have a more unified design structure for the great houses. It would promote cooperation, but also would ease logistics. This is really when you start to see the Imperial Navy form, and the names would begin with IKS, Imperial Klingon Ship. And one of the first of this new generation was the Dama class, the Devastator 4, the D4. These started to be produced in the early 22nd century and would continue production through at least the mid-century, and this would be the new backbone of the fleet. The warp nacelles, the ring shape was elongated into more of an exposed wire shape. The hull was made sleeker, better armor plating, tubing or piping, rigging was apparent for energy transfer. This is part of the new shield system. The disruptor cannon was perfected, and heavier reliance on new photonic torpedoes was established in more of a forward-facing structure. with a bridge in the front. Typical Klingon design, frankly. These were considerably smaller, a bit more efficient. They were just over 200 meters long, 205, 210, and they had a reasonably large crew of around 300 to 350, more if warriors were needed. With advancements in tech, fewer were technically required. And they were, yes, capable of Warp 5, at least in a pinch, although they really didn't want to go much past Warp 4 because of their somewhat larger size and heavier shielding as part of it. This would be one of the first Klingon vessels to encounter the humans as well, although for some unknown reason, Captain Vor'cha's ship in some historical holodramas was humorously accidentally replaced with a much later Katinga. Oh well, what can you do? We've even heard that some human holodeck programs portray their own vessels from that era in less than authentic ways, even randomly killing off crew that didn't actually die. Yes, the D4. This would be the backbone of the fleet and really inspire design for a long time. It was a heavy hitter, but was resource intensive to produce and wasn't the most maneuverable. Required a decent large crew. It's time to diversify the fleet. Now that we have gone out and conquered an empire, having met the Vulcans and Andorians and now humans, we need to patrol and show the flag, and while not outright conquering, maybe just, poke, raid nearby species so we can get away with what we can take from unsuspecting, lazy cargo capitalist merchants, and let everyone remember what Klingons are all about. This is around the time the military caste is really taking control, mid-22nd century, and therefore a new ship design concept is coming online. Meet what the Vulcans coined the Raptor class, a name the Empire liked enough it took it for itself, because that's what the point was, to be a type of bird of prey, if you will, a quick strike vessel, but also a patrol vessel. And whereas many other Klingon vessels before and in the future would be rather cozy, cramped living, this would be a different design. In fact, we have a new type of warp nacelle, and this would be the most powerful warp engine for a long time, capable of reaching warp 6 and cruising comfortably for long durations at warp 4.5. This was a yet smaller vessel, although by the standards of the day not tiny, about 145 meters, consisting of a total of 4 decks, although only 2 were really the full length of the vessel. It was well armed with 2 photonic torpedo launchers and 2 to 3 disruptor cannon. It had a reinforced hull, molecular bound hull, for going into atmospheres of various planets, raiding missions. The trade-off was, while the hull itself could be polarized, shielding was not practical for this vessel. It was a smaller reactor pit, for one, and what energy was there was needed for the weapons and the warp systems, so it relied on its actual armor and hull and polarizing for defense. This was a patrol vessel for sure, and a raider, meant to operate 6 months away from home. They even had the luxury of live food on board, to keep morale up, of course. And the crew would have relatively spacious room. A standard crew of this was only 12 for long-range patrol missions. The additional space could be supplemented by warriors, or bounty, be it in living organism form to sell to the Orions, or cargo, plunder. Either way, there was a decent amount of space on board to stick things in. And this would be one of the first birds of the Empire, if you will, and a smaller style vessel, not to replace the D series, but to supplement it. Yes. So, with that, these would last in service front line for a century. The first Raptors would be fielded around 2130, 2135, and would still be in operation into the 23rd century. And in fact, the lineage would last into the 25th century, but we'll get there when we get there. A bit of a unique experimental design. This was cutting edge Klingon Imperial technologies. The look kind of pervades. But, well, the fleet is quite diverse. Really just start to see mass production in this era, and therefore specialist vessels. The next major vessel release, the next direction for the fleet, might have been a little unpredicted. What if we combined elements of the D4 and the Raptor? The speed of the Raptor and some of its more advanced technology, but with the heavy-hitting combat capabilities of the D4. So next in the Devastator line, well, the D5. And this really did combine both. Quite interestingly, it's smaller than the D4. Lengthwise, it's about the same, 200, 210 meters. But it's a much flatter system. It does have a somewhat smaller crew as well, of maybe 150 to 200, depending on how many warriors are on board. But has a lot going for it. It has the bonded reinforced hull, although not quite as thick as the Raptor. It has quite proficient warp engines. Not as fast as the Raptor, but it's capable of hitting warp 5 and cruising at warp 4 to 4.5 quite easily. It also has the more advanced sensors of the Raptor. But from the D4, it has the heavy hitting. It has a major forward photon torpedo launcher and an aft launcher, sometimes at least. It has 2 heavy forward-firing disruptors and 2 medium disruptor cannon and a turret on the bottom. Very good for defense, either direction, or planetary bombardment. By this point, we definitely know that transporters are in regular use. And so this would be a very versatile vessel. Quick and nimble, more than the D4. Not sacrificing much, but still much heavier hitting than the Raptor. These would be used for standard battlecruisers, blockade defense. We often see them used as flagships of admirals as well. In fact, this was a very popular design. Introduced in the year 2146. These were already entering service in the field by 2147. We know for a fact that these were still in frontline service by high-ranking honorable warriors like Kor into the 2260s. His famous command ship, IKS Klothos, would raid several Starfleet Federation colonies, even trying out one of the brand new at the time from the Romulan cloaking devices in the late decade. And so the D5, in upgraded form, of course, would not be retired until the late 23rd century, and it's possible that some houses kept these on even longer. But in the mid-22nd century, this was very much one of the top-of-the-line vessels for the Empire. But technically, it was a somewhat lighter battlecruiser compared to the D4. The D4 was the slower, chunkier, could take a hit more backbone of the fleet. This was the quicker, smarter, slightly smaller strike. It was geared more towards attack. And so it made a name for itself and was a bit of an experiment, if we're being honest. And feeling that there was still room for more patrol and scouting vessels that could be easily mass-produced by any of the houses, even the smaller, minor ones or less economically privileged ones. And in the year 2149, an iconic Imperial vessel first took to space. The Vor'cha class. The first that alien species are referred to as a bird of prey. This would be a lineage, a class, somewhat replacing the Raptor, but not fully. This would be one of the smallest warships ever created by the Empire, at about 115 meters, total of 4 decks. Standard crew could be as few as 18 or up to 48, depending on the role and mission. These are meant for long-range patrol, scouting, but also just to provide a raider. This was a gunboat. This was a change for the Empire, who had mostly focused on the long-range torpedo, first spatial, then photonic, with the disruptor, beam, or pulse being a secondary weapon. This would flip that on its head. While it would retain a torpedo launcher, a primary in the nose, some report a secondary in the rear for aft defense, its main armament would be disruptors, and it had 8 of them. We have 1 heavy on the wing, a total of 5 standard, and, taking a lesson from the turret of the D5, 2 light turreted disruptors on the underside. This first generation bird of prey featured an adjustable geometry wing with 2 main positions. One was really to allow the bottom turreted light disruptors a full 360-degree arc, also for landing and other operations, but it would not have the same range of motion as later variants. And you might wonder, why have this in the Raptor? Well, 2 different design philosophies, possibly 2 different manufacturing yards. The Raptor had a very heavy hull, but no shielding, and the bird of prey was kind of the opposite. Its hull, while having armor, wasn't especially strong, and it did have some weak spots, including the plasma junction back here. On the other hand, it used shielding, energy shielding. So with the shields up, it could take a hit, but when they would go down, it was more vulnerable. The Raptor had very good sensors and very good speed, but its armament was average. 2 disruptors, 2 torpedo tubes. The bird of prey, while only had 1 torpedo tube front and rear, as I said, had 8 disruptor cannon, including 1 heavy, which was really punching above its weight class because that was something more found on one of the D types. And even the light disruptors, because of their very good arc of fire, were effective enough. And the mediums were just, well, all-purpose. So it was geared more towards attack, with most of its armament facing forward. It also featured tractor beam emitters, a new technology for the day and time. And it even held 1 short-range shuttle on the underside for patrol missions and ferrying troops back and forth. And counter to propaganda against the Empire, Klingon vessels have always had escape pods because there is no honor in dying in futility. Last resort, perhaps, but just in case. It is a kind of bulkier, boxier design. These were usually commanded by lieutenant commander types or commander rank, not full captains. And we see the recently disgraced Duras encountering a human cruiser in the year 2153. And the 2 engagements there really prove that this is more or less on par with the human ship, depending on armament. I should also note that this version was created long before the cloaking device entered the Empire and was not designed for it. But simple and cheap to produce, requiring relatively small crew, and kind of pioneering the primary disruptor armament. This would remain in Imperial service until the 23rd century, widespread use being upgraded, and was quite famous for its type and really wouldn't make a name for the bird of prey. But while we've looked at the warships, with the D4 being the heavy hitter backbone, the D5 being the medium command cruiser, strike cruiser. Think of this as more of a battleship. This is more of a battle cruiser. The Raptor is more of a science raider scout, and the bird of prey more of a raider gunboat. Those are the primary weapons of the Empire in the 22nd century. But what about commerce? That's still going on. Here we have the venerable old passenger transport. Not especially quick. Warp 3 perhaps, somewhat greater in a pinch. Very traditional warp engines. Quite compact at around 60 meters, but with a somewhat tall hull. Standard passenger capacity of around 50 for a short to medium range voyage. Simply getting Klingon civilian colonists from here to there, or in a pinch, warriors. Although since it was lightly armored and lightly armed, this would not be the primary transport for warriors. No, these would simply cruise the Empire, delivering people, resources from point A to point B. It's an older design. They came into service about the same time as the D4, so very early 22nd century. Mass-produced, easy to maintain, very forgiving, easy to push past its limits. A good, solid, honorable Klingon vessel. Next, and you could be forgiven for mistaking this for the D5 Battlecruiser. After all, it came from the same shipyard and same shipwrights, but it's a smaller scale, whereas the D5 is roughly 210 meters. This is roughly 155. This is the military tanker. It is built with some of the same components and same basic engine architecture, but is a smaller scale, as you can tell by the windows on the head. The pylons or wings are slightly different, and most noticeably, the turret on the underside is not there. Instead, we have 8 10,000 liter deuterium heavy hydrogen tanks. This is a tanker. It does have one torpedo tube, less launcher, but tube, and light to medium disruptors for defense. But no, this is intended to be a tanker. Although we do see some Klingons, like Korok, using this as a raider as well, but in a dishonorable way against unarmed or lightly armed foes. This craft can be operated by as few as 12, requiring 4 in the bridge for operations. That's not uncommon. Even the D7 and Raptor only need 3 on the bridge. The 4th member on this bridge would be to monitor the deuterium tank's stability. And has a full crew of 12. Which again is quite spacious for what it is, but how many people are needed for a tanker? It is not the fastest in the world. Warp 4, give or take. Unsure if it has shielding or just relies on hull armor and polarization. It is just a derivative used by the Empire. Efficiency and technology, modularity, and a solid, stable design capable of defending itself and outrunning most foes, and of course backed by the Empire itself. These were in service around the same time as the D5, perhaps even slightly earlier because of their simpler construction, and they continued to transport valuable deuterium throughout the 22nd century. Returning to the Imperial Klingon military, we have the transport known as the Maht-H'a class. This is about 90 meters long and quite a lot wide, but only requires a crew of 5 or 6, with its main abilities being personnel transport. A bit of a VIP, if you will. Essentially an overgrown shuttle. It does have 6 light disruptors for defense, as well as a torpedo tube, and shielding, again for defense, and one of the new tractor beam systems. This is simply a transport of good speed, about warp 5, one of the smallest vessels to possess a warp drive of such capacity. Again, to be used by high-ranking officials, also used for patrol and policing actions along the borders to get criminals to justice. One of the smallest vessels in the fleet, but not the smallest. The Tajdik was the smallest member in the Klingon military that it could operate independently, although only for short duration, short range missions, quite frankly. This could really be classed as a heavy fighter. At roughly 70 meters long, it was actually smaller than the military transport and not much larger than the civilian. It is obviously of the Raptor and bird of prey lineage, but a very specialized attack, strike, raiding vessel. It was armed primarily with 2 medium disruptors, one on the wingtips, tractor beams, and relatively light shielding and armor, although it was capable of quite good top speed for its size of up to warp 5. Presumably, also it did have shielding. These were typically captained by a lieutenant or other medium-ranked officer, and had roughly a crew of half a dozen, although it could fit a couple more warriors if needed for a strike mission. Again, these would be sent in to harass or peck on smaller vessels and could be deployed in mass if needed. These were not true starships in the sense that they could do multiple things. Again, not much more than a fighter or shuttle, but significant because it does show evolution of technology. The spars, rigging, or tubing is starting to disappear from Klingon ship designs. These came about in the 2150s, one of the newer designs of the era. And again, show a different design idea and supplement the fleet as such, but do not seem to have been produced in huge numbers. And as the 22nd century wound on, the Empire faced several challenges, including the augment biological crisis brought on by the humans and turmoil within the High Council. The position of Emperor had long since been abandoned. It had been ceremonial even before that, but now it's in the hands of the High Chancellor. So civil war is threatening, fraction of the Empire is threatening. But towards the end of the 22nd century, one new ship design does appear. Next in the Devastator series, the D6, appearing roughly around 2200. This is an interesting upscaling of the D5, kind of matching the D4 and the D5 in the middle, at approximately 215 meters long, but thicker. Shielding. This is capable of warp 7, so a couple of magnitudes better than the D5, certainly more than the D4. The rigging is mostly gone now. We have the same large torpedo launcher in the front that Klingon vessels have mounted for centuries. But really for the first time in this type, disruptors are focused upon. We have 4 heavy disruptors in the front, 2 towards the head, and 2 more on the wings or pylons. And this is a basic evolution of the D4 more than the D5, yet it does kind of fill both roles and bridges the gap. It's the first effort at kind of a universal cruiser. After all, to Klingon sensibilities, there were too many specialized ship types in the 22nd century, especially as it wore on. This was an effort to kind of get back to a multi-purpose battlecruiser, and it would have a crew commensurate at around 300 to 350 warriors when needed. And while it had hull armor, by this point, shielding is the primary defense. Transporters were very much in standard use, yet this comes out long before the cloak. They would produce a number of these, however, production would be more limited than the previous D5, because by the 2240s, the Empire would fracture, and it was basically its civil war, even if it had a bit of a cold civil war, until it was united under D'Kuvma to fight the Federation. But the fleets of that era, the 2250s, were chaotic and not worth talking about here, because this video is on the unified empire. And that would come again in the year 2257, when, under sponsorship of Chancellor Laurel, the historically significant and very famous D7 was first introduced. And these would be in production by the 2260s and be considered top of the line a decade later. Slightly larger than the D6 at nearly 230 meters and with a crew of 400 up to 450 if necessary. This was a true multi-role cruiser. While it had 4 disruptor emplacements, its main armament was in the head in the form of a multi-purpose launcher, photon torpedoes, having switched from the older photonic by this point. It could also launch magnetic charges, even a disruptor torpedo. It was a very hard-hitting, long-ranged, very accurate launcher, which really the whole vessel was based around. This is really at the point, too, where we see Klingon vessels getting rather snug inside. Some of the earlier ones had space, but these had faster warp drives, up to warp 8, old scale for what it's worth at this point, to rival Federation vessels. In fact, that was the idea. This was to counter the Constitution class, go toe-to-toe with it, but have newer technology. After all, the Constitution class was a decade old in 2257. Even with updates, there would be a bit of an arms race throughout the 2260s with the Klingon Empire. These would often operate either alone or in squadrons of 3, especially for patrol duty, and were solid, dependable, durable. In fact, a century later, one was encountered deep in the Delta Quadrant, still operational, much to the credit of Klingon shipwrights. And this really would establish Klingon design for a long time to come, and we see pretty much the awkward elements of the older era gone. New style nacelles, a sleek, tapered neck and head. Again, this relies on shielding for defense. Dedicated command area, impulse drive in the back, and weapons mounted on the wings. Iconic. With limited numbers of D6s, a large fleet of D7s, and even some old D5s in service by the end of the 2260s, a program was started to make a replacement, especially for the older 5s and 6s. Originally to be the D8, a decision was taken to drop the Devastator line, and therefore it would receive its Klingon name of Katinga. And the first of these would be in service by 2271 and would be mass-produced for 20 years. This is actually slightly smaller than the D7, at about 220 meters, but it still had roughly the same crew. Updated technologies. This wasn't a revolution forward, this is just an evolution. We still had a very powerful, long-range, multi-purpose torpedo launcher in front, disruptor cannons, and beam disruptors by this point, capable of warp 9 old scale, shielding, armor. Pretty standard, but this was the iconic Klingon battlecruiser at a period of lessening hostilities. You had a war in 2256 and another very brief war in 2267 that the Organians put an end to, since it was clear that war was not going to happen. In the 2270s, while tensions were still high, it was more posturing and a technology race. And the Federation was introducing a new line of cruisers, and so the Klingons would follow suit with the Katinga. This would still be the flagship of the Chancellor in 2293, Kronos 1. And this would be the first version to feature a cloaking device as a standard feature. Yes, it was trialed out on the D5, and some D7s would have received them, but those were early generations. This would be the first to have cloaks as a standard feature into the 2280s. But it was a rather large space frame for that type of cloak, so an old design was revisited. The bird of prey, the Burrell. This was smaller than the old gunboat style, at roughly 80 meters, so kind of more like the old attack fighter. It was smarter though. While it was armed with 2 medium disruptor cannon and an advanced forward torpedo launcher, and it was capable of cruising at warp 8 and brief bursts of warp 9+. It could be operated by a crew of 12, and it had a reasonably spacious cargo hold and good impulse, good maneuverability. This had 3 wing positions instead of the old 2, and this was designed from the outset to work with a cloaking device. And so it was much easier to cloak a smaller ship, masking its visual and energy profile, and keeping 12 Klingons quiet was easier as well. No shuttle bay, nothing like that, no auxiliary craft, but this could easily land on a planet, complete with landing gear, take off. It was designed as a patrol scout craft, and to some extent light destroyer and fleet support. These would be mass-produced, so the Katinga and the Burrell would be the next generation of warships of the Empire in the 2280s, and would be well known, respected, and feared, with the newer weaponry, heavy-hitting torpedoes, updated plasma disruptors, quite adequate shielding, durable hulls. But of course, being Klingon, both were more geared towards attack than defense, and neither were exactly pointed towards science. Even if there's not an immediate threat of war with the Federation, the Romulans are still out there, other species, plus uprisings within the Empire itself. True, the Empire has enjoyed a good number of decades of unity since the last kind of run amok in the 2250s, and things are more or less looking up. That is until 2293. This is the year the Klingon energy production and mining moon Praxis would explode through unsafe, safety and over harvesting of raw resources. This would not only damage their dilithium output and supply, or their manufacturing abilities, it would also ecologically threaten Kronos. The Klingons would have the resources to deal with this, but if they did that, they would not have the resources to continue the Cold War footing, the arms race with the Federation, and for that matter, Romulans, but namely the Federation. This would lead to the Khitomer Accords. A little bit of back and forth, but they would happen, and this would lead to essentially freezing of fleet developments. No new battlecruiser types would be built, although existing and future Katingas would be assembled. Well over 100 are in service, and several hundred birds of prey. In fact, we start to see this as the time that the bird of prey becomes more and more popular, because it can serve and doesn't cost a lot in terms of material or crew. This is also when the Imperial Navy becomes the Klingon Defense Force. And while there's a ceasefire, an agreement with the Federation in the late 23rd century, there will be a couple of decades of uneasy peace, but thanks to the Romulans' intervention in 2346, a firmer friendship would form with the Federation. And this would set the Romulans as the official adversary of the Empire. They need someone in the Federation as the friend. And while they were still dealing with the catastrophe at Praxis, but at this point they've had half a century to deal with it, to catch up. And so even though the fleet had stagnated, aside from some updates to the cloak and disruptor technology, we will start to see some expansion in the 2350s and new vessels fielded in the 2360s. But for a time, not much happens. For a time in the early 24th century, the Katinga and Beryl made up the KDF. But as times changed and needs were apparent, a new class was introduced. Based on the Beryl, but scaled up, we got to the Kvort class bird of prey, heavy escort or destroyer. This was economical. It did provide something to kind of fill the role between small scout and full battlecruiser. It could be manufactured with the technology and also let the Klingons adhere to all their treaties, and became a very common sight for half a century. Essentially, whereas the Beryl was roughly 80 meters, the Kvort was roughly 150. Its crew was triple at 36, with capacity to carry a few more troops when required. Everything else is pretty well the same. At least 6 decks, probably 8. 3 wing positions, although the Kvort tended to have the center position preferred most of the time. 2 medium to heavy disruptors, 1 on each wingtip, and a multi-purpose ordnance launcher in the nose, quite near the bridge. Impulse drives and compact warp nacelles snugging the hull. This also was built with the quote-unquote new warp scale and capable of warp 8, so not bad for its size and type, and of course it had a more advanced version of the cloaking device. And that was its main thing. This was meant to be, a small battleship. They could come in, all its weaponry was forward, yet it was economical and flexible. It did have more consideration for science and sensors than some earlier ships as well, but make no mistake, it was not a science cruiser. But yes, the Kvort would become very common throughout the 2350s, 60s, and 70s, and really represented the Empire, even sometimes being used as a flotilla flagship. So it was technically a new variant while adhering to a standard hull. It would be a little bit longer before the will and the funding was available to create something truly new. By the 2360s, relations with the Federation were at their peak. Treaty obligations had been met, and the Romulans had recently emerged from their exile. All of this really pressed for a new battle cruiser. The Katinga was getting rather long in the tooth, although the KDF would still field well over 100, and they would still stay in the field for another good decade. However, in 2365, the first Vor'cha was launched. But in the beginning, the first couple of years, these would only be used by the High Council members, the Chancellor, maybe some governors, generals. But by 2369, 2370, they were produced in large enough numbers that they could be fielded and given to average captains, even maiden complete attack assault wings. It's said that this had at least twice the power of a Kvort bird of prey, which frankly I think is a little conservative. And it's definitely based on the old Devastator series. It was 480 meters long, so getting quite large again. Had at least 26 decks and had a substantial crew. Hard to find exactly how many because the different roles could change it. So anywhere from 700 to 1500 as normal. It was quite quick for its day and time. Capable of Warp 9 plus, some even Warp 9.5 later on with revisions. It was also quite maneuverable, agile at impulse speeds. It had quite large impulse thrusters as well. It had good armor for the day and time, shielding, cloak, newer technology. And in some ways it was more spacious than the Katinga. For example, the bridge was slightly larger, although still very much a Klingon layout. The captain did get a sort of ready room for the first time, and there were even VIP quarters on board. Something almost unheard of for Klingon ships. No holodecks, though. Plenty of bat'leth training rooms, though. Standard weapons were disruptors, although there was one heavy, long-range disruptor beam in the front. And it was kind of a multi-purpose installation on the head here. It could fire pulses or a beam. It also was very close to the ordnance launcher for torpedoes or other. And there were multiple standard disruptor installations throughout the hull, as well as aft-facing disruptors and torpedo launcher, primarily for defense. This was considered a battlecruiser or attack cruiser, assault cruiser, because it did emphasize speed. It had good power for its weaponry. It could assault unfortified targets, even planet-side, even some buried underground. But it did struggle a bit when attacking heavy installations, fortifications. It could go toe-to-toe with many cruisers of the day, for example, the Federation, Nebula. But a couple of these would be needed to go after a Galaxy class or a Romulan D'Deridex. But for a few years this was the flagship of the Empire, and it was something truly new that hadn't really been seen in 80 years. The Kvort, while efficient, was just old bird of prey technology, scaled up and slightly improved. And even though this uses the layout of a traditional battlecruiser, it did use newer technology, and it showed. These would be part of assault groups, flanking groups during the Dominion War, and generally speaking would do very well given their size. They also seem to be well suited for more or less mass production, not unlike the D7 and Katinga before it. So the Vor'cha was a very good member of the KDF and would stay in active service well into the 25th, maybe even 26th centuries. However, the next cruiser was a little bit different. The Negvar, heavy battle cruiser, command cruiser, and new flagship. Work on this had been underway. It's kind of a super Vor'cha. So as soon as the Vor'cha was a proven design, construction will begin on the IKS Negvar. It would first be commissioned in 2371 and first appear in active service as the Chancellor's flagship in 2372, assaulting Deep Space Nine. And it was one of the few ships able to breach the station's reinforced shielding and actively beam troops on board. It uses the same basic technology of the Vor'cha, but scaled up. It's about 680 meters compared to the Vor'cha's 480, so a third larger, give or take. And its standard crew was around 1,800, give or take, and that could easily scale up to 2,500 if it needed to carry warriors troops. It also carried multiple shuttles, maybe even some smaller support craft, because this was meant to be a mobile command ship, a base, a flotilla, and it shows. It had one heavy disruptor beam in the front, pretty standard, again kind of like based on the Vor'cha, but more so. Also a heavy multiple torpedo launcher in the front. Then it had 20 standard disruptor banks, a total of 4 torpedo launchers, and redundant warp nacelles, and 2 weapons pods, one under each wing or nacelle strut. These presumably could be swapped out for repair, or replacement, or upgrading. And the nacelles are quite interesting because they're kind of a double overlapping design. It was a large and powerful ship. The large head gave plenty of room for observation, scanners, weaponry, targeting systems, and this was designed to punch through heavy installations, heavy station shielding, or fortified bases on a planet or asteroid. So that's one area it could excel over the Vor'cha. On the other hand, while it was quite quick at warp, up to warp 9.6, sublight, as the mass might kind of allude to, it was a little slower, not near as maneuverable. So once it was pointed in the right direction, it could really deliver some pain, but it might take a minute to get there. In addition, it was quite intensive to crew, and it was rather expensive and time-consuming to produce. These were never meant to be mass-produced, though. Again, they were meant to be built in the dozens, not hundreds. And so at first we just see the Negvar herself, but during and after the Dominion War, several others are built for other important members of the High Council, very important generals or admirals. But interestingly, your more workaday generals like Maht-H'a still preferred the Vor'cha or even Kvort. Politicians seem to prefer the Negvar. Nevertheless, it was a heavy cruiser designed to go toe-to-toe with, say, the Galaxy class, perhaps even a D'deridex. So, this was their answer to the heaviest cruisers from the other major powers, and it was meant to look impressive and to really announce to the galaxy that the Klingons were back. And this was about the time they stepped out on the Khitomer Accords and treaties and were no longer even pretending to adhere to the last century's agreements, which would lead to a brief Starfleet Klingon skirmish, as well as the less than well-considered invasion of Cardassia. But of course that would ultimately lead to the Dominion War, in which the Klingons often bore the brunt. So between the years of 2372 and 2375, the Klingon Defense Force, the Klingon Imperial Navy, really did a lot of fighting. In some ways that was good, other ways it ground them down. But it did show that the Klingons had production capacity and the ability to train competent officers, that's for sure. So, before we move on, we looked at the largest ship. Let's look at the smallest. Meet the Toron class shuttle. Whereas the 22nd century shuttles and small ships were kind of large, because we have the Vor'cha, the Negvar, the Kvort, a need for an independent long-range shuttle isn't that great. So we see pretty small, short-duration shuttles like this. In fact, this is 5 meters or less long, although it does have warp drive, believe it or not. It has basic armor plating and a basic disruptor system for self-defense only, because, well, Klingons aren't going to go anywhere without some kind of weaponry. It can be operated by one, and if you want, you can cram a couple of others in there, because that's what Klingons like to do. But it's a very basic shuttle, small, so it can fit on Kvorts, or many can fit on a Vor'cha. Can operate in atmosphere, space. Although I wouldn't want to be stuck on board one for more than a day or so. Basically, it'd be like getting stuck in a mid-sized to compact automobile. So yeah. But this was the most common shuttle in use by the Empire before and during the Dominion War period. And since it's not as thought out as the 22nd century versions, it kind of tells us that shuttles were of less import. So that gets us through around 2375, 2376. These are the vessels that bore the wars. Again, first with the Cardassians, then the Federation briefly, and then the Dominion, including, yes, the Katinga. Many were left over from the 23rd and early 24th centuries. They were retrofit with somewhat improved sensors, updated cloaks as best they could with their power cores, and they were given heavy disruptor cannon beams. We see these being used as convoy escorts and support strike craft, but they were aging designs. Their hulls, while holding up valiantly, many were lost in the war. The Negvar was powerful, but sometimes a sitting target for Jem'Hadar. Others, they just didn't make enough of them. The Vor'cha was one of the best all-around vessels they had, but many were lost. Same goes for the Kvort, for that matter, the Burrell. My point is, the Klingon fleet was decimated after, and even what they had was seeming quite outdated. A lot of new technologies were apparent, either from the Jem'Hadar or even the Federation's anti-Borg fleet. So, in the late 2370s, new ships had to be built for the Empire. Now, they could just build more Vor'chas, Negvars, and they would. Obviously, building more Katingas is pointless, and even the Kvort is getting quite long in the tooth. So actually, what the Empire did was kind of look to the past, because a medium-sized vessel was required. They had a couple of heavier cruisers and a couple of escort destroyers, but nothing really in that middle range, until the Maht-H'a class and the reintroduction of the Raptor type. Based on the old 22nd century design, this had actually a good bit of new technology, and it was a good place to start because the old Raptor, for its day and time, actually had some of the most advanced technology itself. For one, this had the new ablative armor that the Federation had been using, updating shielding, updating cloak, updated sensors, improved warp systems, capable of reaching at least 9.7 or greater, while still being very maneuverable. It's sublight, and it was a good size, roughly 310, 312 meters long, like a lot of Federation ships. And it would have a corresponding crew of, roughly 100 to 150. Not huge, not tiny, good enough. It still had the very thin profile that Raptors were known for, and featured quite a high degree of automation. And it was well armed. With a good chunk of its weaponry facing forward, we had 4 heavy disruptor banks forward, and we had 4 photon torpedo tubes, and we had 4 medium disruptors on kind of a ball mount for multi-direction capability, multi-targeting. So a total of a dozen weapon emplacements, plus a better armored hull, updated shielding. In some ways, this was the technically most advanced warship in the fleet for a time in the late 24th century. Not the largest, not exactly the most powerful, but it was the smartest, kind of like the Intrepid in the Federation for a time. And they did fill that gap. New ships were needed. These could be produced reasonably quickly. Didn't require a huge number of warriors to operate at full efficiency, yet were good starting points for technology and to fill the roles the Empire was going to need, because it would be licking its wounds for quite some time. And as much as Klingons like tradition, even though this was new, they could credit it towards the old 22nd century design before they encountered the humans and they mucked everything up. But this was just the starting point for the fleet that would see the Empire into the 25th century. Larger things would of course be needed to provide the new backbone for the fleet. So after the Maht-H'a class was successful, that's what designers got to work on. Really falling right in between the Vor'cha and the Negvar, we have the new Mogh class Battlecruiser. Not surprisingly, primarily designed, certainly named by Worf, son of Mogh, now of House Maht-H'a. After the success of the Maht-H'a class Raptor, a new cruiser was needed, and in some ways this is a more conventional design. It's about 555 meters long and has the typical Klingon forward-facing photon and heavy disruptor. It also has 4 turreted dual heavy disruptor emplacements, plus standard disruptors for defense and rear-facing torpedoes as well. Where it is a little different, we have a blade of armor, but we also have a larger navigational deflector from previous Klingon vessels. And we just have a more blocky hull, a more armored up hull. And we have quite a small number of windows, and those that are there are quite recessed. Even though this doesn't have quite the strength of the Negvar, for its size and armor, it's quite durable, more than the Vor'cha. And it actually has a swappable mission module, so that It can be configured for war, science, patrol, exploration, even diplomacy. It doesn't require quite as many crew thanks to advances in modernization, so look for a crew around 700 or 800 as standard, although it could definitely carry more warriors if needed for combat. Like the Raptor, it's capable of quite high warp, at least 9.8, and it carries auxiliary craft. It is simply designed with technology learned from the Dominion War, plus Worf's experiences with the Federation, although after that war, he mostly returned to the Empire. And these would go into production around the year 2400 after rather extensive testing and trials, and allowed the older Vor'cha battlecruisers not to necessarily be retired, but they could be support vessels, second-line patrol ships, and this could be the new standard battleship of the Empire. And just in time, too, because after the explosion of the Romulan star, some turmoil within the Federation, and external threats, the dawning 25th century wasn't necessarily the most peaceful. Plus, as always, imperial politics were rearing their heads. They had been a little dormant after the Dominion War and just rebuilding efforts, but 20 years on, the old rivalries began to show again. Different factions. And luckily, by this point, the Empire had regained its footing. Production facilities, mostly at the Tai Gorkan production facility. Although some ships were still made at the Kronos shipyards as well. So we have major production facilities within the Empire. So we have the Raptor for the smaller scout escort role. We had the Mogh class cruiser for kind of a multi-purpose role. Next, we need a new command ship and long-range heavy hitter. In the 25th century, the largest and arguably most advanced craft in the KDF is the Bortasqu class dreadnought or heavy battlecruiser. And essentially, it's the same basic technologies we've already been looking at, although it does have next generation ablative armor, shielding, heavy cannon in front, multiple photon launchers, multiple disruptor turrets. It does have large docking facilities to serve as more of a command post, repair and replenishment station as well for, Burrell type birds of prey, maybe a Raptor, something like that. It is capable of quite high warp, 9.8, 9.9. Not the most maneuverable though, it's sublight. And the cloaking device, based on its sheer size, it does its best, but it's just hard to hide something. This is about 1120 some odd meters long, which is huge. But keep in mind, decades earlier, the Romulans had the D'Deridex Warbird, which was over 1350 meters. So, yeah, still somewhat shorter than the old D'Deridex, although we do have a pretty chunky hull and quite tall. So quite a bit of room. This can certainly operate as a warship, plenty of disruptors, photon, quantum torpedoes, but it really specializes, for one, it has very redundant warp systems. Each nacelle assembly can really work as its own warp drive. And the head has ample space for everything. Sensors, weaponry, command. The oversized, for a Klingon ship, deflector for better shielding. And more armored hull. Interestingly, even though this is quite large, thanks to automation, it only requires a crew of roughly 1,600, although it can surge up to 3,600, no problem. Either 2,000 warriors or just, command staff. Anytime you have admirals, generals, chancellors on board, they're going to bring their people, and so one man might bring 100 support personnel with him. So ample room for that, and like I said, also auxiliary craft, or allowing other craft to dock with it for repair and replenishment, because some Klingon vessels aren't meant for multiple year deep space voyages like Federation. But yeah, this is the replacement for the Negvar, and much like the Negvar, it's rather expensive and time consuming to produce, but to be fair, it is a more well-rounded vessel. Heavy hitting, but also quite well on defense. And probably more upgradable in the long term. It's essentially a giant space frame. But like the Negvar, they probably will only produce these in the dozens, not hundreds. So it has its role in the fleet. And here are the 3 examples from the current modern Klingon fleet. Of course, there are plenty of older ships in upgraded form still around. So yeah, you have the Bortasqu to really challenge the large ships, Sovereigns, Odysseys, the Deredex, as well as working as a command cruiser in mobile base, and frankly, just to be intimidating. The Mogh is more well-rounded. This is the challenge. Of course, old galaxies and the Valdor type. Any medium to medium heavy cruiser this can take on without too much of a sweat. And they're cost effective enough you can operate them in flotillas of 3 or 6. And in those numbers, with their versatility and intelligence, they can take on just about anything. And for smaller things like steam runners, sabers, maybe some old Defiance, the updated Maht-H'a Raptor is there. It should be able to go toe-to-toe with its heavy offense for anything in the light to medium class, frigates, light cruisers, maybe a medium cruiser. And again, they can produce these in large flotillas, and they can always operate with command cruisers to coordinate and best serve things. And that's the Klingon fleet. We've chased it from really the 20th, 21st century all the way through the 25th. And we've basically seen that we have quick, punchy, small ships, and then we have larger cruisers that are still more geared towards offense than defense, but can take much more beating. And then in more recent years, command-type ships have become more and more prevalent. So what do you think? Alright, now we're in the real world part of the video, and I'm mostly just going to discuss my thoughts and feelings. And I would break it into 2 loose camps here of battle cruisers, but first, the birds. Raptors, birds of prey, the like, the smaller to medium ships. Why not? So, yeah. And starting at the beginning, chronologically, the Raptor. This was really the first Klingon ship design we saw in Enterprise, and would definitely not be the last. I was actually very curious what the Raptor looked like. The Eagle Moss would be the first time I'd ever get hands on one, because this was, long after the old marker machines days and what have you. It's a little different. The nacelles are different than what we'll see later on, but it does have some of the piping around the neck and tubing up here, which you kind of be carried over. It looks a little different than other Klingon designs, but you can ascribe that to being an earlier generation or even just from a different manufacturing yard. That said, I like the design. It's very much in keeping. I think it was difficult for the Enterprise crew after just coming off of Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, to try to mentally shift gears to a different century, a different aesthetic. And unfortunately, Season 1 of Enterprise does suffer from that. But I overall like it. And I think it does fill an important role in the niche. The model itself is almost all metal. It's quite heavy for what it is. Although, our next one, a little different. The early or 22nd century bird of prey. We saw this at the end of Season 2, and this is when we do start to get more of the Klingon aesthetic for this century. It has the piping around the neck. I like how it does have a very bulbous head. And that turret mentioned is quite apparent here. Pretty neat. And then we have some more guns in the back here. One funny thing is I've seen people criticize that the cannons are different sizes on the wingtips, but no, that is absolutely correct to the original CGI model. This did not have a cloak because Klingons did not have cloaks in the 22nd century, and they didn't have them in the 23rd until after at least 2268. It's definitely not in the 2250s. But no, I like this design. If they're gonna do Klingons, and then we're gonna just say the bird of prey was a Klingon design, and I'm generally okay with that, because while the bird of prey started off as a Romulan thing, this look is pretty unique to the Klingon bird of prey. But yeah, it does have a look that's clunkier, more crude. And I love that it's a gunboat. Is it practical? Hell no. Real world? No. But it's the rule of cool. And very Klingon of them. This model from Mogh is quite nice. It's a little small, frankly. But then again, there's a lot going on, and it's a little light. The main body is metal, but then all the things sticking around are plastic. So, interestingly, the wings are plastic. Usually on these they're metal, but I guess they're too thin to effectively be metal. So that's my only thing. It's a little bit lighter than I would like, but to get the right proportions. I kind of wish they'd just scaled it up a bit, but it's not tiny. And I'm really glad they did that, because I really enjoy the new vessels that the Enterprise series gave us. And here is another. We got this in Season 4 of the show. It does have a bit of the generic alien ship number 9 feel to it. I think when it first showed up, they didn't want it to be instantly recognizable as Klingon, but it is clear enough. It's kind of a combination look-wise of the bird of prey and the Raptor. The head looks very Raptor-y to me. The wings, kind of a deviation of both. We never really learned much about this class, and I think we only saw it once or twice. And that's the beauty of Enterprise, that it was at a time when CGI, while still early by today's standards, had matured to the point and had become cheap enough that they could really just make ships for throwaway purposes. By the way, I'm still not 100% sure which way's up with this ship. This way, or this way. Oh well. There's arguments for both. And it's in space, so does it even really matter? But yeah, it's a nice another Klingon ship to get instead of just reusing a bird of prey, which they very easily could have done for that role. But I'm glad they didn't. Kind of goes to show you that the fleet did have some variety to it. Small attack craft, raider craft. Definitely seems very Klingon to me. Unfortunately, yeah, we just never got much detail about it. But nice to add to the fleet while we can. Next, we have the quintessential Klingon ship, or at least one of the two, the Bird of Prey. This was done very early on in the collection, I think issue 3 or 4. And I'm glad they did kind of the Cavort look with the wings in the middle, cruise position. The real world reason this appeared this way was the folding mechanism broke in the show. So they just kind of got fixed in the middle position. But this is kind of the look concurrent with the larger Cavort. The truth is, he just kind of scaled up the Bird of Prey for Next Generation to make it seem a little more threatening. Since, of course, the Galaxy class, hard to be threatened by 12-man cruise ship. But yeah, I like the wide wings brand. This one's actually pretty much all metal. The wings are metal, the head, the guns aren't. The only bad thing is they don't stay on their stands very well, so to keep this one on the stand, I have it a little bit blue tacked. That's why I'm not taking it off. But we can look at what I consider the Burrell version in the collection, with the wings in the quote-unquote attack position. And they did do, of course, wings up in the landed position as well. Because Eagle Moss models are fixed, they don't have moving parts. They ended up doing these two in the standard collection. The landed version was actually a special issue, so not part of the regular series. Is it a little cheesy to have, two different issues just for wings up, wings down? Yeah, probably. But it is a very famous vessel, so take it as you will, But this too, just like the other one, is metal wings, mostly metal body. Of course, the guns and whatnot are plastic, so it's actually weightier than you might think. And of course, this has a sleeker design. As most people who are into Star Trek know, this was made for Star Trek 3, and the idea originally was for it to be a Romulan ship. But it's so different from the Romulan Bird of Prey we saw that when you call it a Klingon ship, that's fine. It kind of fits either. In fact, I think the kind of head look fits in more with the Klingon D7 Katinga than the only Romulan ship we'd seen up to that point, the Bird of Prey of theirs. You can look into it. That's actually how the Klingons got into the whole honor system and all that, as they were kind of mixed up with the Romulans a bit, but that's how time goes. But yeah, they made this model for Star Trek 3 and used it many times. As much as I think it is a neat looking ship, I do feel like it is one of the more overused ships in Star Trek. It's not a ding against its design, but it did get a bit old after all. Plus, them trying to make the Bird of Prey a very effective ship that could go up against large capital ships was a little unrealistic. But yeah, these obviously had to be in the collection. I mean, it's one of the top couple of alien ships in Star Trek of all time. And really set a precedent, given the Klingons on screen, the cloak, and showing the Klingons flew birds of prey. Again, it fits them, their aesthetic, very well. And the ship is a little more rough and tumble, a little more crude. than I would expect from the Romulans anyway. If this had been kept as a Romulan design, unless the changes were made quite a bit, if it was kind of kept this way, I would not really believe it was that either. But, yeah. Not much to be said about the Klingon bird of prey. It's been talked over and over a bit. But Eaglemoss did it justice with 3 different variations of this type, so it's well represented in the series. And really, that's it for the smaller ships. Throughout the whole Dominion War thing, we just had birds of prey. And then we get to the Star Trek Online Raptor here. And I think it's great that they revisited the whole Raptor look, making it sleeker, giving it the modern kind of Klingon boxier nacelles. 2 disruptors here, 2, I guess, kind of ball or turreted disruptors on the head. It's a pretty cool ship. In some ways it's kind of lighter. Most of the weight's your head and your midsection. Your wings are mostly plastic. The top is. The bottom piece here is metal. But then that's plastic. So it's kind of got a front heavy thing. A lot of the Star Trek Online ships are kind of front heavy. Even has a nod to kind of the old school piping here a bit. Not the same style. Doesn't really have it on the wings, but yeah. I think this was the first STO ship I picked up, was the Raptor, if memory serves. Could be wrong in that. I kind of held off getting the Star Trek Online ships for a while. I did start getting into them before they announced the end of the series, but they only did, what, 20 in the series? So not bad. I mean, represented the show quite, or the game quite well. There were a total of 3 or 4, depending on how you look at it, Klingon ships in it. 2 Romulan, 1 Cardi, 1 Dominion, 1 Tholian of all things, and then the rest, 11 or 12, were Federation, which makes sense. But yeah, I think this is neat to see. In universe, it fits in with the Klingon tradition mindset very well. So revisiting the Raptor in the 25th century, and it kind of just gives credence to the Raptor design that it was carried on, because we see the bird of prey being carried on, and we'll see the Battlecruiser carried on. So why not the Raptor? It's an intermediate class, but I like it. It is kind of now looking like it fills the gunboat, and higher technology, small but smart, kind of like an Intrepid class or the Federation role. But it's a neat update, but very, very unmistakably a Raptor class ship. And our last of the little ones. So what about the cruisers? In our first one, yeah, I had a little fun making some head cannon, some beta cannon with. This is, of course, the Vermilion Battlecruiser, seen in Season 3 of Star Trek. However, the same model was also viewed in Deep Space Nine, where it was just kind of a stand-in backup ship for a Klingon family house transport. We see it docking to the station, and it does have a kind of a clunky Klingon aesthetic with the wing area, the neck, the sticky yaddy bits. So I decided it'd be a good inclusion, and I do like the Herc kind of pre-series for the Klingon Empire, explaining how they got space travel, because it does seem like an Enterprise that they're somewhat illogically more evolved than Earth when it comes to technology. Then again, Earth had a major war, but you'd also expect Klingons to. Of course, as everyone knows, this vessel started off in V as an alien ship coming to Earth, and was repurposed for Next Generation. But back then, when studio models were expensive, and this definitely had an alien design, and it was originally meant for an unknown alien species, I think it works fine. It was meant to be a 1,000-year-old ship in a graveyard, and it looks like a 1,000-year-old ship from a graveyard. Just Jim Dandy. When Eaglemoss announced they were doing this, I was tickled. Part of it was, yeah, I didn't really know what the Vermilion Battlecruiser looked like. But I don't know why exactly. I was just really excited to get this ship. And I think they did a bang-up job. It's almost all metal except for like the little head here and the... Actually, can't tell. I think that's plastic. This is metal back here. Considering the real studio model was only half built, they probably did a more complete job at Eaglemoss, even if it's a small scale. But I just was having a little fun with the D series. And I thought this, since it was used for a Klingon ship, even if just not to be noticed as such, would fit in well as one of their early transport / warships. What do you think? Think it was a smart decision to include this, reuse it in DS9, or stupid, or whatnot? I think it's neat. It was a big ship, though. We get the scale of like 600 meters compared to the Enterprise D, so yeah, it was a big one for sure. But I think Eaglemoss did a great job with this. And our next ship is a wee bit controversial as well. The D4. And this is a D4. This is an actual Klingon ship. And this has been accepted by all of us fans, but it never actually appeared on screen. But it should have. Early on in Enterprise's first season, they had a Klingon episode. And they needed a Klingon Battlecruiser. And this was created by an overworked, underpaid design team. And for really, really dumb reasons, rejected by the staff, who just at the last minute threw in the reused and recycled Katinga from the motion picture. And why would a Katinga be flying in the mid-22nd century? No one knew. It made no sense whatever, fucking ever. But this was designed for Enterprise, and if it wasn't for just stupid decisions of executives who didn't really get Star Trek fans and how obsessive, but honestly loyal we are, this should have been the ship. And this is one of the earliest designs that has the Klingon kind of open-ended loop nacelle, has the struts around the neck, very traditional battlecruiser head. I think it is a cool design. It's a little closer to the standard Katinga D7 than maybe I would have gone for D4, but it's different. You can tell that they tried to make it look older. This is one of the first efforts, and if this had come in the show, I think it was episode 3 or 4, 5. It was very early. It was in the single digits. Fans would have loved it, just because we've heard of the D5 for a long time, going back to the animated show. But to see the D4, its predecessor, and to make it look noticeably Klingon, but also different, I think it would have came in very well. Kind of giving the traditional look. This in universe would be the first of the classic battle cruiser with kind of the flare and the nacelles and the head. And Eaglemoss did this as a bonus edition, a special edition, because it was never much more than a concept, CGI of course, model, but it has been used in catalogs and calendars. And I bet you anything, if they ever do a remaster of Enterprise, they will pop this into that episode instead of the very out of place Katinga, as they should. So probably one day it'll be fully canon, but to all of us, this is what was in the show. Luckily, I'm blind, so I never knew differently. But it goes to show you, I like Eaglemoss's concept models. They've done some really cool ones. They did the Concept Reliant. They did several of the Excelsior study models, which, to be fair, did exist as such, but barely on screen. So, pretty neat And this was definitely what should have been in there and would have been a great aging but still effective Klingon battlecruiser for the 22nd century. Very, very good job with this that they did, in my opinion. But what do you think? And like I said, it kind of sets that design aesthetic firmly in place. But our next vessel really solidifies it. The D5 battlecruiser, referenced in the animated series, like I said. Some don't consider the animated series canon. Okay, fine. Also referenced in Deep Space Nine. So very firmly established in canon. Also established as an old ship by the mid-23rd century. Meaning in the mid-22nd, since Klingon designs seem to last a long time, this would have been cutting edge. I think it's a little interesting that overall it seems a little smaller and sleeker than the D4. But who's to say each D has to get bigger, right? After all, we see the Katinga is technically shorter than the D7. Anyway, we have two variants here. And ironically, in the episode Marauders, we see this variant first, which is technically not a D5, I think, the tanker variant. And this was one of the last ships I ever got directly from Eagle Moss. This was a special or bonus edition after they'd wrapped up the 180 issues. And as you can see, it's got the tanks down here, the deuterium tanks. It's got 8 of them for a total of 80,000 liters. In universe, this is supposed to be smaller. It has a crew of about a dozen. Needs at least 4 to run it. The now common nacelles. It's a very flat ship. I, of course, never knew what the D5 looked like before Eagle Moss. Thank you, them. And so I was kind of surprised how flat it was. And like a lot of the STO ships, a lot of your weight is in your head. And also your fuel pods are metal. So this is all metal. And you get to the wings. And these are plastic along with the nacelle. So, and it does run metal all the way to the back here. But it kind of gives it a center to front heavy thing. But yeah, we see this as a fuel tanker. And it's just a reuse and modification of the CGI model. They added more and bigger windows. Removed some guns. A bit of a, I don't want to say hack job, but I get it. In the show, it was meant to look like a pirate vessel, marauding vessel. A tanker to take from the colonists, but also needed to give some threat to the Enterprise. It's just really cool that Eagle Moss did this particular variant. Even if it was extremely late. I wasn't even sure if I'd ever get it. As I've said in many videos over the years, that's what's really neat about their collection. It's not so much that they do the big ships like the Bird of Prey. I mean, they have to. And most of your fans, casual especially, just want those. But for those of us that have had plenty of models over the years of different things, having these weird variants just really does it for me personally. I like the weird obscure ones. But they did a good job with this. But pretty early on in the collection, I think it was within the first 50 or so issues, we got the D5 Battlecruiser. And this is the same CGI model. Again, technically seen later than the Marauder vessel, but I have to wonder if this wasn't designed first in studio. Instead of the tanks underneath, we have piping, and then we have a turret down here. Seems like it's kind of for bombardment. I don't know if it can't really fully rotate. Looks like it can just swing 180 degrees front, center to the back. Still good for that arc of fire, and this having a turret really melds it in well design-wise with that Bird of Prey. This too is center metal. In fact, it's a little bit lighter than the tanker because those tanks on the tanker were metal, and we don't have the tanks here. So this is metal, wings plastic. A cool design. Definitely kind of going with the sleek bird aesthetic. Doesn't look as clunky or primitive as the Bird of Prey from this era, or even maybe the D4. But this was the premier Klingon ship, And as we know, they would stay in at least second-line service for a century. And for a Klingon ship, that's perfectly acceptable. Of course, the real-world reason for Klingon ships hanging around was the studio models needed to be reused. They put a lot of time and money into the Katinga and the Bor'cha, so they were going to reuse them. And it's actually very good for Next Generation to have movie studio quality models, miniatures, for a TV show. Made it look very good. And in fact, that's a good segue to the next one. The D7, the classic TOS ship, is appearing in season 3. Yeah, it wasn't in season 2 in the original show. I had to think. It's been put in for TOS Remastered for season 2, but this was in season 3 of the original series. And, as you already noticed, when I was doing my talk about, this was not the D7 model I decided to feature. Why the hell did I do that? Why not use this classic design? Here are my reasons. See if you agree or disagree. Yes, even that might be considered sacrilege to some, I decided to use the Disco D7. Not the first ship they tried to call it D7 in season 1, but the one from late in season 2. It's the same ship, honestly, just higher resolution for all intents and purposes. The reason this D7 has that sleek appearance, you could say it's because it's a futuristic design. Funny, though, that ships from Enterprise and TNG, none of them have, especially Klingon, this really smooth, sleek design. They're always a little rough around the edges, past and future. This is the outlier when you line all the cruisers and things up. Of course, the real-world reason was twofold. One, this was made on a TV budget, from wood, mostly. Two, it was meant to be seen on a TV screen of the 1960s. Those were quite small, 13 inches, even 19. 19 was considered quite large. Most TVs back then, if they were bigger than that, they weren't by much. Heck, when this first aired in 68, a lot of the TV sets were still black and white. Ask me, I know. When I was a kid, the only color set in the house was in the living room. And it was a big TV. I think it was 24 inches or 26. The bedroom had, my parents' bedroom had a 19-inch black and white, and mine had a 13-inch. So, yeah. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but what's the point of putting all that detail in, especially on the budget they had to work with by season 3 of the show? Very tight budget. In fact, it was thanks to AMT that they even got this, because they paid for it. The only place that has some decent detailing are the nacelles, and they're pretty basic even at that. I just think when you put it with the other Klingon ships, this D7, while it's a classic design, and I love it for what it is, it stands out. This one, on the other hand, when you put it in, it fits. They did a good job with the Discovery. Some have criticized the nacelles for being kind of Discovery-ish. I could see that, but then again, the Klingon nacelles were always kind of square and blocky anyway, so, but it has the same long head, neck. Fun fact, what became the torpedo launcher on the original D7 was originally meant to be its deflector dish. It just ended up being kind of used as a torpedo launcher. They did flatten out the bridge module a bit. That's okay, frankly. And then the rear superstructure, they kind of slid it a bit to be a little more interesting. But I think this is a perfectly good physical update. Kind of like when video games first had polygons. Think of the original TIE Fighter game. They didn't have bit mapping. They just had the polygons with some shading. And then when they updated it, they went to bitmap textures on the polygons for X-Wing versus TIE Fighter and X-Wing Alliance. It seems like what they've kind of done here, this reminds me of a bitmapped original D7. They even have this warp core on the bottom. This was one of the first Discovery Klingon ships that actually interested me. But I applaud them. And Eagle Moss did a great job. I'm a little that this is in the second scale from... This isn't the large scale. It's the medium. All the Discovery ships were, and all the really later ones. So it does look a little weird putting it with the other ships, I fully admit. But what are you going to do? They did get a job, though. This is metal. And the neck has some metal coring with the plastic details, and this head is plastic. Most of your metal is this whole area back here. So it has some good weight to it. It's a decent sized ship in general. So I am not apologetic for using this as my D7 compared to this. You could try to say they're two separate designs, but frankly, they're too close together, both in the timetable and the look. It's clear that if the money had been there, this would have looked more like it had been. In fact, although some disagree, Gene Roddenberry said that point blank when the motion picture came out, that that's how he envisioned the Klingon ships and the Enterprise to have looked always. Just, he was working with a TV budget. Some might disagree with Gene. He certainly said some interesting things over the years, not all of which are canon, so I'm not one of those folks that thinks if Gene says it, it was automatically true. Just ask his opinion on the animated series. He waffled back and forth many times. So in my head, yeah, these aren't separate designs. This is just kind of how the D7 always looked to me. However, this next one I can slot in right before it. The Klingon cruiser, I think they might have even called this a Klingon warbird, from the JJ film. Rather briefly seen in the Kobayashi Maru simulation. This was a John Eves design, and since it wasn't critical to the film, he was kind of left to his own devices to design it. And I think it's a neat design for what it was. Very much a Klingon battle cruiser, but different from the D7 and the Katinga, for that matter. Flatter back here. Very boxy nacelles. Kind of disruptor bulbs or turrets on the wings. And interesting kind of spinal column look to the neck that to me seems like a reasonable transition from the old piping rigging look to the sleeker look. It has a busier neck. It's a flatter head. This to me really fits right in between the D4, D5, and the D7. And since we need a D6, we've never really seen one. Sure, I thought this would be put right in. Ironically, opposite to the Disco one, this one has most of its weight in the head. This is metal, but a lot of the wing is plastic, with this being metal. So it does have metal running all the way back, but it's actually heavier in the front. This whole neck area, flat neck, metal. This is in the same medium scale, but I do think it slots very neatly in to the lineage. And in my headcanon thing, I just said that they made fewer of these because of the Klingon schism, because we don't see them more. I know this is from the JJ films, but realistically this would have been pre-Kelvin, because we see this in a simulation in the 2250s. You could technically say it was changed because of the Kelvin thing, but realistically it probably would have been an older Klingon design on record. No reason to think the Kelvin incident would have rippled that far to change Klingon ship design. but I do like it. It's a fuckload nicer than the JJ prize. Moving on. The quintessential, some might say everlasting, Klingon battlecruiser, the Katinga. If you'd asked Gene Roddenberry, this would have been what the D7 always looked like. But fans have decided it was a later design, at least analogous to the Enterprise refit of the Constitution class. We see this at the very beginning of the motion picture. Then that same footage, edited of course, was reused for the beginning of Wrath of Khan. Would be absent for a couple of movies and then reappear for The Undiscovered Country. But by that point it had been featured in Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, and, as I already said, mistakenly seen in Enterprise 2. What to say about it? I mean, it's the Katinga. It is the Klingon ship next to the Bird of Prey, frankly. And this was my very first Eagle Moss model. It was, what, issue 6 or 7 in the series, and where I hopped in, I don't know, I always liked the Katinga. And the thing is pretty light. The metal is the center part. The head is plastic. But this actual model will always be sentimental to me since it was my first of all of them. I would quickly get others in the subscriptions and all that, but this was technically the first one that came in the mail. And not a bad place to start because it is kind of spread out. I mean, it seems a little small because of how thin the neck is, but that's proportional. And lengthwise, when you measure here to here, it's a handful, literally, palm size. So, yeah. Did this cruiser stay in service longer than it should have? Yeah, but at least when they show it in the Dominion War, they don't act like it's the biggest, meanest thing. They call it an old cruiser, and they pretty much admit straight out that it is used for convoy escort service, second line service. Basically, it's their T-64 or T-62 tank drawn out of storage when they needed more bodies in the field. But I always really like these. And that's the only Klingon ship we really got in Season 1 of Next Generation. In the Worf episode. You know the one I'm talking about. Some people hate that episode. I think it's a good episode. Perfect? No, but, you know, for Season 1 of Next Generation. So we still see these flying very much in the 2360s. Of course, again, the real world explanation is it was a movie model able to be used in a TV show, so why the hell wouldn't they do it? And it's a cool looking ship and instantly recognizable as Klingon. Even if the Romulans took the D7 for a spin for a minute. But finally, with Next Generation, the budget by Season 4 would allow for a new vessel. The Vor'cha was the first Klingon ship, really only one of two, we got for Next Generation. And while it would be reused quite a bit, I've often thought it was underserved in DS9. I think the folks at DS9 just had a soft spot for the Bird of Prey. And that's okay. But while we see these referenced a lot on diagrams and in dialogue, I feel like they weren't seen as much on screen as they could have been. I still felt it was kind of odd that Martok's command ship was a Bird of Prey and not a Vor'cha. But regardless, this is definitely an attempt to modernize the classic Battlecruiser look, and yeah, it does it. I really like this design. I still like it today, but I think I liked it more when I was a kid. It's a little something to me today. Again, I do like it, but it's lost a little luster for me, just in the design aspects. I don't know, hard to put those things into words. But I'm really glad the Klingons finally did get another ship. We see this first as Chancellor Kimpek's ship as he's dying. The one with Duras and all that. So they started off just using high-ranking ships. But soon this would just be the Klingon attack cruiser. Used for the Dominion War. Eaglemoss did a really good job with this one. It's mostly metal, including the nacelles, the head. So there's a little plastic here in the middle of the bottom where it bulges. But it's quite weighty. It's a good size. This was done quite early on in the collection, I think within the first 20 issues or so. So that would have been within the first year, as needed to be. I mean, it's not as iconic as the Katinga, the Bird of Prey, even the D7, but it's pretty iconic. It's the next generation Klingon ship, and they did it justice. The next one, though, maybe not so much. The Negvar. Now, in universe, this was Gowron's command ship, and it was the newest ship in the fleet, around 2372. But by that point, we'd actually already seen it once before in the All Good Things episode, the series finale of Next Generation. A version of this was seen as the future Klingon ship. Sometimes they're called like the Vude class or the Imperial class. And we see it in the last episode, another future episode of Voyager, in a slightly altered form. But this is the one in the prime timeline we see. And this was done around the end or beginning, into the second year, beginning of the third year of Eaglemoss. And at first it seems like it's a well done model for what it is. Fun fact, they actually use the Vor'cha as the base for this. Even though in the universe it's a bigger ship. They use kind of the same wings, flipping them around, adding the head here. But Eaglemoss made a weird mistake with these. This bottom is hollow, and the ends of the nacelles are hollow. It's almost like pieces were supposed to go there, covering pieces, and they just never did. Not sure what was up with that. Rarely does Eaglemoss make that kind of mistake. Typically, if they did make a mistake, it was more of a typo. You know, misspelling a name on a shuttlecraft or something like that. But this kind of hollow cavity on the Negvar is peculiar. And back here. I don't even know what the real studio model looks like. I don't know, do we ever see it from this angle? You have to tell me. So maybe those spaces just weren't filled into the model. Still yet, usually when there's an unknown thing, like with the Vermilion Battlecruiser, they'll use a little license to make it in. I think it was just a manufacturing oopsie. Oh well, it doesn't ruin the model, especially considering they're all in the back, so pointing forward, looking from the top, you'd never know. Does have the big siege cannon in the front, which is kind of neat. I'm really glad they did this. These weapons pods or secondary nacelles, whatever you want to consider, they're there. Not all variants of this had it. They had to do the Negvar. It was such a, hey, Klingon ship. And this was really the second one done for Next Generation for the future scenes, as I said, and then it would start appearing in season 4 of DS9 and would be used on and off ever since. Neat design, but just, yeah, not as neat as the Vor'cha, both the actual studio model and the Eaglemoss version. And as far as cruisers we saw on screen, that's really it. But we do have our Star Trek Onlines to talk about too. I've said in the past that even though the Star Trek Onlines are technically the same smaller scale, the 3 to 5 inches as the others, they seem a little bit bigger, like 10-15% bigger. And this is a good example, the Mogh class. This is a heavy die-cast model because it is kind of blocky. It's almost all metal. Not bad for something that was a CGI before. It definitely has elements of other Klingon ships going in. I kind of like how squat the neck is for once. Instead of being strung out, it's really kind of compacted in with very long nacelles. I like the look of it. It is very much Klingon. But also video game Klingon, if that makes sense. The large, very squared off deflector is a little bit derpy looking. Other than that, though, I have no real criticisms. It's a neat ship. Always nice to have another Klingon ship in the fleet, regardless. And I'm just impressed with how hefty this thing is. It's amazing the effort that Eaglemoss put into the online ships, which were always going to be a pretty small market, which does explain why only 20 were made. But we still have one more Klingon. This is another one that just seems big. It's more stretched out. It's not quite as entirely metal. It's a little bit lighter in the back than the other, but it's still pretty dang impressive. And the head's all metal. Definitely a replacement for the Negvar. You gotta have the big command ships of the fleets. That's just part of it. And again, this model is quite chunky. Kind of wish the Negvar was made this size, even though it's only a little bit bigger. Just in, an extra 1/4 inch really can help give some girth. And this has got it. As with the previous ship. I can't say that either design just makes me go, wow, that's amazing, but they're good video game starship designs, and that's typically what we've seen, even going back all to the old days of like Bridge Commander, Armada. You want to have ships that are still recognizable as that species that you are trying to go for. Doesn't pay to go too extreme in a good video game. And I think it's really neat that they did these ships. It expands the universe, especially for a race like the Klingons. It just didn't have all that many ships, really, until Enterprise, if you think about it. We had the original ships, a couple Next Generation DS9 ships, but the Klingon fleet was very small until Enterprise. And so with the STO expanding it even further, hey, that's pretty great. With that, let's kind of wrap up talking about some random ships here and there. And just because it was already on the table, the Klingon shuttle. This was part of the final shuttle pack that Eaglemoss ever did. Up until the last pack, they were all Starfleet or Federation ships, some civilian human ships, and you had that one pack that was all Kelvin, JJ-verse ships, shuttles. But at the last one, they finally broke ranks and did aliens. You had the Ferengi, you had the Vulcan from Enterprise, you had the Xindi from Enterprise, and you had the Klingon shuttle here. Oops, I don't know where I was pointing you. Oh well. But, wow, this is Klingon, at least in the plating. This model was reused and modified a bajillion times within Star Trek TNG, so it's really recognizable as a myriad of other ships. But we saw it in Season 7 of Next Generation. It's a good size for being a shuttle. The shuttles were made in kind of a smaller scale. It's 2 some odd inches long, but it's all metal. It's very solid. And yeah, they did these stands. I'm not really crazy about the shuttle stands. They just made a little plinth, which all the standard Eaglemoss ships have a custom-made stem, but they didn't do it for the shuttles. Interestingly, the Vulcan and the Xindi got a custom-made one, but the Ferengi and the Klingon didn't. So it because it's so heavy, it likes to slide off like no one's business. I'm glad we did it, though. It's always nice to have auxiliary ships, and it was nice that we finally got an alien shuttle pack. And speaking of shuttles, this is the transport from Enterprise. While we see it used as kind of a medium size, like I said, it's 80-90 meters in the show, which is not tiny. Originally, this model was meant to be the Klingon shuttle that crash landed in Oklahoma for the opening episode, so a single person occupant shuttle. So it was technically scaled up a bit. I will say though, for this model, it's big. Like, this was a standard issue. Mass wise, it's one of the most massive. All metal up here. Part of the bottom is plastic, but metal. Yeah, they did a really good job. I mean, maybe partially just because of the design being pretty simplistic. It doesn't immediately jump out at you as Klingon, but it does have Klingon emblems on it, just so you don't mistake it. Which would have made sense if it was a crash-landed shuttle in Oklahoma. Broken bow, as it happens. Humans wouldn't know what those symbols were, but we would have. But, yeah, they did a really good job with it, so I wanted to mention it. And then we have what is known as the Rebel transport, and we see it in Enterprise. This is what the refugees are fleeing in, but it's very clearly a Klingon design. This is part of what gets Archer in hot water with the Klingons. Pretty basic design with Klingon style warp nacelles on it. I think it's neat that we see visible docking ports here, again giving us a pretty good sense of scale, that it's not too big. And the piping on the top was meant to kind of resemble a old-fashioned steamboat, like a riverboat, Mark Twain. So it was meant to look quite old and rustic by Klingon standards. It's neat. Again, Eagle Moss was great for giving us background ships like this. And this one's a pretty heavy deal. This is mostly all metal till you get to the nacelles. And it's nice to see Klingon civilian ships, because they'd have to have them. But speaking of odd designs, let's talk about my choices when it comes to disco, because I did sprinkle a few in this video that I thought were kind of fitting. I did consider using all the disco Klingon ships, but most of them just... I don't hate the designs for alien ships, they'd be fine. But I didn't think you wanted to sit through that, and I didn't feel like doing it. But I wanted to kind of make D1, D2, D3, D4 in the episode, so I picked this one to be one of the Ds. Because while it's not uniquely Klingon, it's an older ship by Discovery, and it actually seems like an early space ship, kind of like something from The Expanse a little bit. It's spiky in all the right places to be Klingon, at least aggressive looking, but you can almost see this spinning under its own to produce artificial gravity. So I think it's one of the more believable spaceships we see. We have impulse thrust in the back, and we do have these two things on the side here that can be warp nacelles. So it's one of the Klingon ships that actually does look like a spaceship. And it does look suitably primitive. And I do like it. I mean, it's a neat looking ship. It's one of the few that just makes for a good background ship. So that's why I selected it. And again, I did consider including all the disco Klingon ships. Eagle Moss gave us a good number of them. Not every single one, but a good number. But this one fit in quite well, if not perfectly. And then, of course, is the other one that might seem controversial to some, but here's why. Look, I needed one more D. And the sarcophagus ship, the ship of the dead, the Black Fleet ship fit. And it's a really interesting design. And Eagle Moss really did do a good job with this one, even if you don't like Discovery of the ship. It has the Klingon head to it and body, even primitive wing structures and all that, but then it has these huge nacelles, which to me just scream like primitive warp tech. Taking the storyline aside, I will say that even in Discovery, this is said to be roughly 200 years old, so that fits in nicely for the mid to late 21st century. And again, Eaglemoss just, they did this one as an XL version, they did a few specials for Discovery, like one was the Starbase, another was the Mirror Universe command ship, and this was their first special, so they did it as a, not oversized, but they wanted to convey that it was a larger, more impressive ship than your standard Klingon. So I really had to pay tribute. With all the stuff going on, the spikes and the veins and everything, to knock this out, it even has the little sarcophagi on the hull. I really just wanted to pay credit. Plus, I would believe this is an early Klingon ship. You might not, and that's okay. But even if I didn't like the storyline around it, especially the whole stealth or cloak technology that they tried to get away with, the ship itself would fit in well to me. Not as a 23rd century Klingon ship, but as a 21st or 22nd, which is exactly what it was in the show. So, okay. And again, I have to give credit to Maker when they do a good job. So much plastic and all this, of course, because of the sticky Yeti bits. I will say too, I paid little to nothing. I found this thing on clearance sale when Eaglemoss was going out and picked it up for like $25-30. So I couldn't say no to that. So because I like it and because I got it for such a good deal, I wanted to feature it in my episode. And hey, my episode. So there we have it. It's kind of the random ships and what have yous. What do you think? Let's wrap things up. Well, there we have it. This video definitely took a little longer to make than the Romulan and Cardassian Dominion ones, but I thought it was worth it. As I've said, the Romulans are my favorite alien race. However, the Klingons are totally the most important, and I mean, who doesn't love Worf and Martok and even Gowron? I mean, one of the best semi-villains in the show. Politicians. And even, Discovery. What can I do? Another story for another day. Sorry if you wanted me to include the Discovery Klingon ships, aside from the couple I did. But this was long enough and enough effort. Maybe next time. And I really don't feel like the other ones fit in, frankly. I can squeeze in the sarcophagus ship, and I actually think they did a bang-up job with their D7. But I almost put their bird of prey. It's probably the one that's closest to getting in, but it doesn't really fit in well between the Enterprise bird of prey and the original, just classic bird of prey. I don't know. I could have squeezed it in, but again, long enough. Some of the other designs I really like the look of. I just can't really see them as Klingon. Oh well, editor's choice, right? So which ones are your favorites? Do you like the kind of bird of the prey look, or do you like the Battlecruiser, the attack cruiser look? As much as I like birds of prey, I have to admit I kind of like the classic Battlecruiser from the D7 and Katinga. Yeah, I still like the Vor'cha, but really the Enterprise ships, the D4, the D5. Enterprise did the Klingons right. As important of a race as they are, they just had so few ships up to that point, and Enterprise gave them the most, even if we had a rocky start with the false use of the Katinga. But, yeah, more than half the Klingon fleet before Discovery came from Enterprise. So, huzzah to them. And love it or hate them, you have to admit that Picard Season 1 gave the Romulans a number of new ships, as did, again, love it or hate it, Nemesis. But wanted to give the Klingons justice
drug out most of the ships I had. I didn't bring out the other bird of prey and kind of a few background ships, but yeah. So, what do you think? What do you like? What do you hate? What ships do you absolutely despise, too? As always, though, please do comment. It's just fun to discuss. If you could, do like, share, and subscribe. If you'd like to support, I do have a Patreon, have for years, over on Mishaco. With that, this is Misha, and Qapla'.